when a blind black man walked into a shelter asking for the one dog no one dared to touch. The staff thought he was making a mistake. But what they didn't know was that he was about to awaken a memory buried in fur and fire, a past that tied their lives together long before that day. Like, share and subscribe if you believe some souls are meant to find each other, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. When Elijah Brooks, a blind black man in his late 30s, walked into the rescue shelter asking to meet a retired K9 named Ranger, everyone froze. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled of disinfectant, damp fur, and rusted cages. He stood with a quiet confidence that didn't fit the setting, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat still dripping from the rain outside. "Sir, please, he's dangerous," the shelter director said quickly, stepping in front of him like she was trying to stop an accident before it happened. Elijah turned his face toward her voice, the milky haze in his eyes catching the light. "Dangerous," he repeated softly, like testing the word on his tongue. Or just misunderstood? The question hung heavy in the hallway. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded letter, an official notice approving him for an animal companionship program for the visually impaired. The director took the paper, but didn't glance down. Her eyes were on him, uneasy. "Mr. Brooks Ranger isn't a guide dog. He's a retired police K9. He was taken off duty after biting 3 handlers. He's been declared unfit for rehoming." Elijah smiled faintly. "Unfit for rehoming. I've heard that one before." His tone was even, but there was a weight behind it, the kind of pain people carry quietly when the world decides who they are supposed to be. "Please," he said, "I just want to hear him." The volunteer at the desk, a young woman named Claire, looked uncertain. "You mean see him?" she asked. Elijah tilted his head slightly. "No, I mean hear him." His voice was low, gentle, deliberate. "You can tell a lot about a soul by the way it breathes." Claire glanced at the director, who hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine," she said, "but keep your distance." Elijah followed the sound of keys jingling as Claire led him down a narrow corridor lined with cages. Dogs barked and whimpered, paws scraping against metal. The noise grew fainter with each step until they reached the farthest end, where silence took over heavy electric silence. That was where Ranger waited. Claire's voice lowered to a whisper. "That's him, cage 16. Elijah tapped his cane twice on the concrete floor, locating the barrier in front of him. Then he heard it, a growl so low it felt more like vibration than sound. It rolled through the air through Elijah's chest, grounding him in a strange, unspoken recognition. He didn't move closer. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice steady. "A Ranger, right? They tell me you're the dangerous one." The growl deepened for a moment, then stopped. "You sound like someone who's been through a lot." Elijah continued. "I know that sound. Used to hear it from guys pulling victims out of burning buildings. Fear and grief, they sound the same, don't they?" Claire took a step back, nervous. "Sir, maybe we should." But Elijah lifted a hand gently. "It's okay," he said. "He won't hurt me." He crouched slightly, letting his cane rest beside him, his open palm hovering a few inches from the bars. The growl returned softer this time, layered with confusion. Elijah smiled faintly. "You don't know this, but I can't see you," he said. "They call me unfit too. Lost my sight pulling a little girl out of a fire 2 years ago. Nobody knew what to do with me after that. I was too broken to save anyone else." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the lights and the soft tap of Ranger's claws shifting. Then unexpectedly, the dog let out a slow, shaky exhale. Elijah's fingers brushed against the cold metal bars. "You and I," he whispered, "we both got left behind, didn't we?" The air changed, less tension, more curiosity. Ranger moved closer, just enough that Elijah could feel the warmth of his breath through the bars. The shelter director, watching from the hall, clenched her clipboard. "He's never done that before," she murmured. Claire blinked. What stopped growling? The director stepped closer, eyes wide. He usually lunges, but Ranger didn't. He just stood there, his nose inches from Elijah's hand, trembling, but still. Elijah didn't rush the moment. "You've lost someone," he said quietly. "I can hear it in you, the way you breathe. That short inhale before you growl, that's fear, not hate." He took another slow breath, letting Ranger hear the rhythm of his calm heartbeat. "You're not dangerous," he murmured. "You're grieving." The dog's breathing hitched, and for one fragile heartbeat, it sounded almost like a whimper. Claire covered her mouth. "He's never," she whispered. Elijah didn't react. He stayed perfectly still, his hand hovering in the space between them. Then Ranger stepped forward, closing the gap, pressing the side of his muzzle against the bars. Elijah smiled, tears forming behind his glasses. "There you are," he whispered. "That's all I needed." He didn't touch the dog, just stayed there, letting him choose the distance. When Ranger finally stepped back, Elijah straightened up his cane, tapping twice again. "Thank you for trusting me, old friend," he said softly. The shelter director found her voice. "Mr. Brooks, I don't understand. How did you?" Elijah turned toward her, that faint smile still there. "Sometimes you don't need eyes to see someone's heart," he said. "You just have to listen long enough." Ranger had once been a name that meant courage. In the police force, people used to say, "If Ranger's on the scene, the bad guy won't make it 2 blocks." He wasn't just another K9. He was the kind of dog officers told stories about in bars after midnight, the one who could track a suspect through 2 miles of swamp, or pull a wounded officer from behind a crashed car. His partner, Officer Miles Carter, was his other half. Together, they were legend. But legends fall hard. The night it happened was cold and wet, much like the afternoon Elijah Brooks had stepped into the shelter. Sirens had cut through the fog, and Ranger had been first through the door of an old warehouse where a suspect held a child hostage. Officer Carter had been right behind him. The explosion wasn't large, but it was enough. Metal shards, smoke, screaming, the kind of chaos that rewires a soul forever. Carter shielded the boy, took the hit, and never got up again. When they pulled Ranger from the rubble, his chest heaved with smoke and confusion, his handler's scent fading under the stench of fire. That's when something broke, not his body, his heart. He stopped eating, stopped obeying, stopped being the hero everyone knew. He lunged at the first officer who tried to leash him. By the third attack, they stopped trying. The report filed 2 months later labeled him aggressive, retired, unfit for service. They kept him alive because no one had the heart to put down a dog who'd saved so many, but no one dared get close either. That was the story Ranger carried like a scar no one could see. When Elijah arrived the next morning, the staff watched him with a mix of curiosity and dread. Most visitors didn't come back twice, especially not to see Ranger. But Elijah had said he would, and when he made a promise, he kept it. He walked the same path down the corridor, cane tapping softly, his steps unhurried. "Morning, old boy," he called quietly. The sound of shifting paws echoed from the last cage. Ranger had recognized the voice. The growl that followed was different this time, uncertain, low, but not angry. Elijah smiled. "You remembered." He knelt by the cage again. "I read something about you," he said. "They said you saved a child once." That true Ranger tilted his head, ears twitching. "You must miss him," Elijah continued. "Your partner. Everyone says dogs forget, but I don't believe that. I think you remember too much." He reached out slowly until his hand brushed the bars. Ranger didn't move away. He simply sat there, breathing deep, his nose pressed against the cold metal. "You know," Elijah murmured, "I used to wear a uniform too. Not blue like yours, mine was yellow. Fire department." His tone darkened slightly. "The day I lost my sight, the smoke was so thick I couldn't even see my own hands. But I heard a child crying inside. I went anyway, pulled her out. Didn't make it back before the ceiling fell." His laugh was small and bitter. "When I woke up, everything was black. The doctor said I should be proud, said I saved a life. but all I could think about was the man behind me who didn't make it out. He ran his thumb along the metal bar. You and me, we both lost our partners in the fire, didn't we? For the first time since he had come to the shelter, Ranger pressed closer, his body trembling. The air filled with that quiet, broken sound of a dog trying not to whine. Elijah lowered his voice steady, but filled with warmth. It's okay, boy. You don't have to guard the pain anymore. It's not your fault. Ranger's ears flicked a single huff, escaping his throat. The staff at the far end of the hall whispered to each other, stunned. He's listening to him, one said. I've never seen him so still. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of fabric, a patch sewn with the faded emblem of his old fire station. He rubbed it between his fingers, then held it near the cage. This belonged to my partner, he said softly. Sometimes I take it out when I need to remember that being broken doesn't mean being done. Ranger sniffed the air drawn toward the scent. He stepped forward until his muzzle touched the patch through the bars, breathing it in. Elijah smiled, a tear sliding down his cheek. You feel that. That's what love smells like, when it's been burned but still alive. The director appeared beside them, arms crossed, but her expression softer than before. Mr. Brooks, you're really not afraid of him. Elijah shook his head. No, ma'am, I've learned that fear doesn't heal anything. Listening does. He turned his face toward Ranger again. We're both still listening, aren't we? That afternoon, as Elijah prepared to leave, Ranger didn't retreat to the corner of his cage. He stayed near the front, watching, waiting. When Elijah reached the door, the dog let out a single bark, not a snarl, not a warning, but a statement. It was the kind of bark that sounded like memory. Elijah paused, his hand on the door frame, and said quietly, I'll see you tomorrow. Later that night, the shelter staff reviewed Ranger's file again. One volunteer noticed something strange. The boy Ranger had saved, years ago, the one from the warehouse explosion, was listed in the records as rescued by responding firefighters. The report named a single firefighter who'd entered the building and pulled the boy out before the collapsed firefighter Elijah Brooks. The realization hit the director like a quiet thunderclap. Ranger hadn't just been responding to a kind stranger. Something in him had remembered the scent of the man who'd carried his handler's last rescue to safety. The bond between them wasn't new. It was rediscovery. The next morning when Elijah returned, the staff didn't try to stop him. He walked in cane, tapping Smile, calm and certain. Morning, Ranger, he said, voice full of quiet pride. Guess we've both been heroes once, huh? Inside the cage, Ranger's ears perked, tail twitching faintly. He stepped forward without hesitation, pressing his forehead against the bars. Elijah knelt again, his fingers brushing the cold metal just above the dog's muzzle. Yeah, he whispered. I thought so. The next morning began with rain again, soft and steady, against the windows of the shelter. Elijah Brooks arrived earlier than usual, his worn boots squeaking on the linoleum floor as he tapped his cane in a rhythm that Ranger already knew. The staff no longer warned him or tried to hold him back. They simply watched as the blind black man who had somehow reached the heart of the most broken dog in the city made his way down the corridor like he belonged there. The moment Ranger heard the familiar tapping sound, he stirred, tail thumping once against the metal floor. He was waiting. Morning Soldier Elijah said, stopping in front of the cage, You sleep better last night. The question was rhetorical, but something in the dog's slow exhale felt like an answer. Elijah crouched down his cane, resting on the floor beside him, and continued. I brought something today. Something that might sound strange, but I think you'll like it. He pulled out a small portable radio, one with a cracked antenna and worn buttons. When he switched it on, a soft wave of jazz filled the hallway, echoing through the metal cages. The melody was slow, calm, gentle. It filled the empty spaces that words couldn't. Ranger tilted his head. ears twitching his eyes, softening as though the music spoke in a language only he could hear. "That sound right there," Elijah said, "is the closest thing to forgiveness I know. It doesn't fix what hurts, but it makes the hurting quieter." He leaned closer, lowering his voice as though telling a secret. "You know what I think, Ranger? I think you're not afraid of people. You're afraid of silence, because silence reminds you of what's gone." The dog made a low, mournful sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a whine, something in between. Elijah smiled sadly. "Yeah," he said, "me too." The staff at the far end of the hall peeked around the corner, whispering to each other. They had seen therapy sessions, rehabilitation attempts, even professional handlers fail to reach the dog. But this man without sight, without fear, spoke in a way no one else could. It wasn't training. It was understanding. Ranger took a step forward, closer to the bars, his chest pressed against the metal. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply placed his hand flat against the cool surface palm, steady. The dog mirrored him, paw resting just above the same spot. Two broken souls meeting halfway. Elijah started talking not about the past, but about the sound of the world around them, the rhythm of rain on the roof, the quiet hum of the lights, the faint hiss of the radio. "Most people don't really listen," he said. "They just hear. There's a difference. Hearing is automatic. Listening takes heart." Ranger's breathing matched his voice, slow and steady. "The first sound I remember after the accident," Elijah continued, "was a heartbeat monitor. I thought it was mine, but it was the girl I saved. I heard it speed up every time someone spoke to her. That's when I realized something, boy. Love has its own sound. You just have to be quiet enough to notice." For a long moment, the rain outside grew heavier, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Ranger's ears flicked toward the sound, a faint tremor passing through his body. Elijah sensed the change immediately. "Easy now," he murmured. "That sound scares you, huh? Reminds you of something." The thunder cracked again, louder this time, and Ranger let out a deep growl, backing into the corner of his cage. Elijah stayed where he was, calm and grounded. "You're okay," he said softly. "It's just the sky shouting. It doesn't mean danger anymore." The growl softened, then stopped completely. Elijah kept talking, his words becoming the steady rhythm the dog clung to. "You hear my voice, Ranger. Stay with me. The world's noisy, but you don't have to be afraid of every sound. Not all loud things mean pain." Gradually, Ranger crept back toward the front, his head lowering, tail tucked, but no longer shaking. Elijah smiled. "There you go, brave boy." He switched the radio to another station, one playing an old gospel tune about mercy and home. The melody filled the air like a prayer. Ranger laid down, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Elijah listened too, the corners of his mouth softening. "You feel that?" he said quietly. "That's peace, buddy. We don't get it often, but when it comes, we sit still and let it stay a while." The shelter director appeared again, arms folded, but this time her face wasn't cold. "He's calm," she whispered. "He hasn't been calm in 2 years." Elijah nodded without turning, because no one ever told him he could be. Ranger shifted, making a small sound like a sigh. "He's been waiting for this," Elijah said. "To be allowed to just exist. Not as a tool, not as a monster, just as a soul." The director didn't answer, but the wet shimmer in her eyes said she understood. Hours passed like minutes. Elijah stayed with Ranger long after visiting hours ended, reading out loud from a worn Braille Bible he kept in his coat pocket. The words weren't about religion, but about comfort, about light surviving darkness. "Even if I walk through the valley of the shadow," he read, his deep voice steady, "I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Ranger shifted closer to the sound, his head pressed against the bars. "You believe in that, boy?" Elijah asked softly. "That we can still walk even when we can't see?" Ranger's tail thumped once faint, but real. Elijah smiled through a tear. "Yeah, I think you do." As dusk fell, lightning flashed again, illuminating the hallway. Ranger didn't react this time. He simply lifted his head toward Elijah's voice, steady and certain. "You did good today," Elijah said. "The sound didn't break you this time. That means it's losing power. He paused, listening to the rhythm of the rain slowing outside. Maybe tomorrow we'll try stepping outside the cage for a few minutes. Ranger gave a quiet grunt that almost sounded like agreement. When Elijah left, the staff found Ranger lying near the front of his cage, eyes open, watching the door instead of the floor. It was the first time in years he hadn't turned away after human contact. He stayed that way until the shelter lights dimmed for the night, his breathing matching the faint echo of Elijah's departing footsteps. Later, when the staff reviewed the surveillance footage, they noticed something none of them could explain. During the thunder, when Ranger had first panicked, his heart rate on the monitor had spiked until Elijah spoke. The moment his voice filled the air, Ranger's heartbeat slowed, returning to normal within seconds. It was as if the man's voice had rewired the dog's fear, transforming chaos into calm. He responds to his voice like it's a command, one volunteer whispered. The director shook her head. No, she said quietly. Not like a command, like a memory. By the fourth morning, the shelter no longer felt like a strange place to Elijah Brooks. The echo of his cane had become part of its rhythm. The dogs no longer barked when they heard him coming, and even the staff had stopped whispering warnings. Rain had given way to a pale sunlight that poured through the windows, warming the cold floor where the cages lined up like lonely confession booths. Ranger was waiting at the front of his enclosure, his ears pricked forward, his eyes bright but cautious. He had learned the sound of Elijah's footsteps, the pattern of tap and pause that came before that calm, deep voice. Morning, Ranger, Elijah said, smiling faintly. You still keeping the night watch? The dog exhaled a low wolf-tail tapping once. The room around them fell quiet. The director, who had been pretending to check files, looked up from her desk, frozen by the sound. It wasn't a growl or a bark. It was a response. Elijah crouched beside the cage, setting his cane down carefully, his voice lower now, intimate like a prayer. You know I don't see much these days, but I can picture you. I bet you've still got that proud stance, chest-up chin, high eyes sharp like you're waiting for the next command, only there isn't one anymore, is there? Ranger shifted his weight, head tilted slightly. Yeah, Elijah murmured. That's the hard part, when the world stops asking for you. He took a slow breath, pressing his hand gently against the metal. But you've still got purpose, boy. You just haven't found it again yet. For the first time, Ranger made a sound that wasn't fear or tension. It was low, soft, uncertain, like the first note of a forgotten song. Elijah smiled, recognizing it for what it was. That's your voice, he said. Didn't think you remembered how to use it. Ranger blinked, confused, but curious. Elijah leaned in slightly. It's okay, you don't have to be quiet here. I'm listening. The dog huffed again, his nose brushing the bars as though testing how close he could get. Elijah chuckled, the sound warm and rich. You're talking to me now, aren't you? Guess that makes us friends. The shelter director whispered to one of the volunteers. He's talking back. The volunteer nodded, eyes wide. I didn't think he could. Elijah continued to speak softly, his hand still steady on the bars. You're not angry, Ranger. You're just tired of being unheard. I know what that feels like. People used to tell me I was lucky to be alive. They said that like it was supposed to make me grateful, but they didn't see what I lost. His voice trembled slightly, but he didn't stop. When I pulled that girl from the fire, I thought I was saving her. I didn't realize I was leaving part of myself behind. Ranger let out a faint sympathetic sound, his eyes locked on Elijah's face, as if understanding every word. You ever feel that way, Elijah asked? Like you did everything right, and still ended up alone. Ranger's breathing changed a single sharp inhale, then a slow release. It wasn't language, but it was communication. Elijah smiled through a tear he didn't bother to hide. That's what I thought. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it carefully, revealing a tarnished dog tag. "You know what this is," he said. "Belonged to a firefighter who didn't make it out of that building with me. I carry it because it reminds me that sometimes love outlives the people who give it." He tapped it gently against the bars, the metallic sound echoing softly. Ranger's ears twitched at the noise, then he moved closer, his nose touching the tag for just a second. Elijah whispered, "That's right, boy. That's sound. That's memory. You remember yours too, don't you?" The air between them shifted. The room that had once been filled with the smell of fear and disinfectant now felt alive, charged with something fragile but real. Ranger sat down, head bowed, breathing slow. Elijah stayed quiet for a moment, letting the silence become comfortable instead of heavy. Then, without warning, Ranger made a low sound, a single note that rose into a soft, deliberate whine. Elijah's smile widened. "That's it," he said. "That's your first word." The dog tilted his head again, tail brushing against the floor, uncertain but brave enough to keep trying. "Go on," Elijah urged gently. "Say it again." Ranger let out another quiet whine, this one longer, steadier, carrying a tone that wasn't pain, it was relief. The sound rippled through the shelter. For the first time in years, Ranger had spoken, and it wasn't out of anger. It was out of trust. Elijah pressed his forehead against the cage bars, emotion tightening his throat. "You don't even know what you just did. To you, that sound means you're still in there, still fighting. You just needed someone to hear you." The director wiped her eyes, whispering, "I think he just said thank you." Elijah smiled faintly. Maybe he did. Or maybe he's just reminding me that we're both still learning how to talk again. He reached through the bars just enough for Ranger to smell his hand. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he nudged it gently, his nose warm against Elijah's palm. The man laughed softly, the sound trembling, but full of light. "Well," he said, "guess we're both getting better at this." As the sun shifted across the floor, the shelter grew quieter. One by one, the other dogs settled, soothed by the calm energy radiating from the man and the animal at the end of the hall. Claire, the young volunteer, leaned against the wall, whispering, "It's like they're talking in their own language." The director nodded slowly. Maybe they are. Elijah stayed until evening, speaking in that low, rhythmic tone that seemed to steady Ranger's heartbeat. He told stories about music, about firehouse camaraderie, about the way sound could paint pictures for those who couldn't see. Ranger listened to every word, his eyes half-closed, tail occasionally twitching, as though keeping time with the cadence of Elijah's voice. When the closing bell rang, Elijah rose slowly, brushing dust from his coat. "You did good today, partner," he said softly. "Spoke your first word and everything. Tomorrow, maybe we'll try two." Ranger whined once more, almost protesting the man's departure. Elijah chuckled. "I'll be back before the rain does. You can count on that." He took his cane and started down the hallway. Halfway to the door, a sound stopped him. A bark strong and short, but filled with life. Elijah froze, then turned his head toward it, smiling through tears. "That's my boy," he whispered. "That's what I wanted to hear." The fifth morning came with a quiet stillness that felt different from the others, the kind of calm that hangs in the air right before something beautiful happens. The shelter was half empty that day. Most of the volunteers were off on weekend duty calls, leaving only Claire and the director tending to the animals. Elijah Brooks arrived right when the sun touched the windows, his steps slow, but certain, his cane tapping with a rhythm that Ranger recognized instantly. The moment the sound echoed through the corridor, Ranger rose from the concrete floor, ears alert, tail wagging in a soft pattern against the bars. "Morning, Ranger," Elijah said, stopping in front of the cage. "Heard that bark yesterday. You still proud of yourself?" The dog gave a short, quiet rumble that almost sounded like laughter. Elijah chuckled under his breath. "I'll take that as a yes." He crouched down, resting one knee on the cool floor. "You know, when people lose their voice, it's the same as losing their hands. You can't reach out anymore. You stop being part of the world. But you found yours again. That means you're ready for the next step." His hand hovered near the bars. He didn't touch yet, just let the dog see the gesture, sense the intention. Ranger tilted his head, studying the movement. His instincts fought against his curiosity. The soldier in him warned not to trust, but something in Elijah's presence disarmed that old reflex. The man smelled like earth smoke and warmth. Not fear, never fear. Elijah's voice softened low and deep like the hum of a gospel record. "I'm right here, boy. I'm not going to hurt you. Just going to let you decide what happens next." Ranger took a tentative step forward, muscles tense beneath his coat. Elijah heard the faint shuffle and smiled faintly. "You're thinking about it, aren't you? You want to, but you're not sure if I'll flinch. I won't, not ever." He extended his hand fully now, palm-up fingers relaxed the universal sign of peace. Ranger froze a foot away, breathing quick and shallow. Elijah stayed still. Seconds stretched like hours. The man's breathing became the anchor, the sound Ranger had learned to trust. Slowly, the dog lowered his head, his nose brushing against Elijah's palm. The contact was barely there, a single heartbeat of touch, but it was enough. Elijah didn't move or speak, just let the moment breathe. Ranger sniffed once, twice, then pressed closer, the tip of his nose grazing the calloused skin of the man's hand. Elijah's eyes filled with tears behind his sunglasses. "Hey there," he whispered. "You're doing it. You're letting the world touch you again." Ranger didn't growl, didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned into the warmth, trembling from a storm that wasn't fear anymore, but release. Elijah let out a slow breath, his fingers brushing gently through the air until they found the rough fur of the dog's muzzle. The sensation hit him like memory life returning after years of darkness. "You feel that," he murmured. "That's what forgiveness feels like," Claire gasped softly from the end of the hall, one hand over her mouth. "He let him touch him," she whispered to the director, who stood frozen in disbelief. "He's never let anyone I know," the director said, her voice cracking. "Just let them be." Elijah kept speaking his words, threading through the quiet like music. "You remember your partner, don't you?" he said softly. "He was your person. You probably still wake up thinking you'll hear his voice." "I know, boy. I wake up expecting the sound of fire trucks sometimes. That's grief. It pretends to be loyalty." His hand found Ranger's cheek, and the dog didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted closer until his head rested lightly against Elijah's palm. "You don't have to protect the hurt anymore," Elijah whispered. "He wouldn't want you to." Ranger made a soft whine, low and tender, the kind of sound that broke every heart listening. "That's right," Elijah said gently. "Let it go." Minutes passed. The shelter seemed to fade around them. Outside, sunlight stretched across the floor, touching them both like a silent blessing. Elijah moved his hand slowly, fingers tracing the outline of the dog's head, feeling the scars that ran beneath the fur. "You've been through so much," he said. "But look at you now. You're still here. You're still fighting." Ranger exhaled through his nose and pressed his forehead against Elijah's arm. The man laughed quietly, tears sliding down his cheeks. "That's it, boy. That's trust. That's what healing looks like." The director turned to Claire and whispered, "Get my phone. Record this. People won't believe it." But Claire shook her head. "No," she said. "This isn't for a camera." She wiped her eyes, whispering, "It's just for them." Elijah stayed crouched, speaking softly as he stroked the side of Ranger's face. "You know something," he said. "When I lost my sight, I thought I'd never see beauty again. But I was wrong. I can see it now in the way your heart beats, in the sound you make when you stop being afraid." He laughed, the sound breaking into a soft sob. "I used to think saving people meant running into fire. Maybe it just means showing up when no one else will." Ranger lifted his head, eyes meeting the man's face. He could see no fear there, only warmth and recognition. The dog nudged forward, nose pushing against Elijah's chin. The man smiled through tears. "That's a kiss, huh? Haven't had one of those since before the accident." Ranger licked his hand, once hesitant, then again with more certainty. Elijah laughed, a deep, joyful sound that filled the empty hall. "You're full of surprises," he said. Didn't think we'd get here so soon. The director, standing a few steps away, whispered to herself, "He's healed." But Elijah shook his head gently without turning. "Not yet," he said softly. "Healing's not a place. It's a road. We're just walking it together." As the afternoon passed, the two stayed in their silent communion, neither willing to break the fragile thread of peace that connected them. The shelter was bathed in a golden light that made the dust shimmer like tiny blessings floating in the air. Ranger lay down, his body stretched near the bars, his eyes never leaving the man sitting beside him. Elijah leaned back slightly, humming the same gospel tune he had played days before the melody, low and slow. Ranger's breathing synced to its steady calm safe. When the time came to leave, Elijah rose carefully, brushing the dust from his knees. "I have to go now, Ranger," he said softly. "But I'll be back." "You know that, don't you?" Ranger let out a quiet huff and pressed his head against the bars, again waiting for one more touch. Elijah reached out, resting his hand gently on the dog's head one final time before stepping back. "Good boy," he whispered. "You're not alone anymore." The next morning, the light that filtered through the shelter windows was warm and golden, touching everything in soft hues of forgiveness. Ranger was already awake, pacing near the bars with the quiet restlessness of anticipation. His ears twitched every time he heard a distant sound, waiting for the rhythm of footsteps that had become his heartbeat, the steady tap of Elijah Brooks's cane. When it finally came, a chain reaction rippled through the shelter. Every dog barked once and then fell silent, as if even they knew this was not a man you interrupted. Elijah smiled when he heard Ranger's breathing quicken. "I can hear you, boy," he said, his tone playful but tender. "You been waiting for me, huh?" Ranger let out a low, happy grunt, tail brushing the metal behind him. Elijah crouched by the cage, his hand resting on the lock. "You remember what we did yesterday? That touch." The dog exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring as he pressed closer. "Yeah," Elijah said softly. "That wasn't luck. That was trust. And trust means we can start healing the hard parts now." He lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the floor, his back against the opposite wall of the narrow corridor. The position was deliberate, unthreatening, open-inviting. "You see, Ranger," he began, "there's a kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. It's the one you share with someone who understands your pain." The dog tilted his head, listening to the slow cadence of Elijah's breathing. Elijah continued, voice low and calm. "You and I, we've got the same wound. We both lost someone who believed in us when no one else did, and we both think we failed them." His words lingered like smoke in the still air. "When I lost my partner in that fire, I thought I could have done more. When you lost yours, you probably thought the same. That's the trick of guilt, it keeps whispering, even when the fire's long gone." Ranger's body and tensed his ears, flattening slightly. "It's okay," Elijah said, sensing the change. "You can listen to it. Just don't believe it." He pulled a small object from his pocket. A dog whistle, dull and old, with a crack running down the middle. "Found this in a thrift shop last night," Elijah said with a smile. "Thought maybe we could start something new." He blew softly, the high-pitched sound too faint for human ears, but sharp enough to reach Ranger's soul. The dog stiffened, then tilted his head again, eyes narrowing in recognition. Elijah lowered the whistle. "That sound used to mean orders, didn't it?" he said. "Go, stop, stay, attack, every command tied to duty. But we're gonna rewrite it. From now on, it means peace. It means you're safe." He blew the whistle again, softer this time, his fingers tapping against his leg to create a rhythm. Ranger's tail twitched, uncertain but curious. "That's right," Elijah murmured. "It's just a song now, nothing to fear." The director watched from down the hall, whispering to Claire. "He's reconditioning him without any training tools." Claire shook her head. "No, he's not reconditioning. He's reconnecting." They both fell silent as Elijah spoke again, the whistle dangling from his hand. "You know," he said, "I used to hate quiet. After I lost my sight, the nights felt endless. I'd lie there and hear the world moving without me. But one night, I heard a sound that saved me. He smiled faintly. A heartbeat, my own. I realized I wasn't gone. I was still here. That's what you have to remember, Ranger. You're still here. He extended his hand slowly, letting the dog choose again. Ranger stepped forward, the movement fluid and full of intent. His nose brushed Elijah's fingers, then his forehead pressed gently into the man's palm. The contact was firm, not trembling this time. Elijah's throat tightened as he whispered, "There's my boy. You're not broken. You're grieving." He let his fingers slide along the dog's muzzle, feeling the scars and ridges that marked his past. "Scars don't mean you lost," he said. "They mean you survived." Ranger exhaled heavily and sat down, resting his weight against the bars. Elijah laughed softly. "Yeah, I get it. I'm tired too." Minutes passed in wordless companionship. Elijah began humming that same gospel tune, again slow and rich. Ranger lowered his head to his paws, eyes closing, lulled by the vibration of the man's voice. Elijah's song carried words he barely needed to speak. "Grace will lead me home." The shelter was silent, except for the hum, the rhythm of two lives sinking for the first time in years. Then Elijah said, "You know what's funny? I used to think blindness was my punishment. Now I think it's a gift. It made me hear the world the way you do. Every breath, every tremor. It's all conversation if you know how to listen." The dog shifted slightly, resting his muzzle closer to Elijah's leg through the bars. The man's smile widened. "That's right. You don't need words to tell me. I can hear it." He paused, his hand still resting on the warm fur. "You feel that heartbeat, Ranger? That's two lives keeping each other alive." Outside, the wind began to rise, stirring the trees. The faint scent of rain drifted in through the open vents, and thunder muttered again somewhere far away. Ranger's ears flicked toward the sound, his muscles tensing instinctively. Elijah reached up, brushing the dog's neck with his fingertips. "Don't run from it," he said softly. "Storms don't come to break you. They come to remind you you're still standing." Ranger's breathing hitched once, then steadied. The thunder rolled again, louder now, but the dog didn't move. "Good boy," Elijah whispered. "See, you're already stronger than yesterday." After a while, Elijah leaned his back fully against the wall, fatigue beginning to settle in his limbs. "You ever think about what happens after healing?" he asked quietly. "People think it means going back to who you were before, but it doesn't. Healing means becoming someone new, someone who remembers the pain but doesn't live in it." His voice broke slightly on the next sentence. "I think you and I were supposed to remind each other how to do that." Ranger opened his eyes, meeting the man's face through the shadow of the cage. He tilted his head and let out a soft rumble, deep and calm, not fear, not aggression, recognition. Elijah smiled, wiping at his eyes with his sleeve. "Yeah," he whispered. "I know, boy. I feel it too." As evening approached, Claire unlocked the side door and called out, "Mr. Brooks' visiting hours are over." Elijah rose slowly, joints cracking from sitting too long. All right, he said, patting the bars one last time. "You hear that, Ranger? We'll keep walking this road together tomorrow." The dog stood tail wagging lazily, no trace of fear left in his posture. Elijah took one step back and listened. Ranger whined softly, then barked once, a single sound that filled the hallway like a benediction. The director standing near the doorway whispered, "They're healing each other." When Elijah reached the door, he paused and turned his face toward the cage. "You're teaching me, you know," he said. "You're showing me that the things that break us can also rebuild us." Ranger pressed his paw against the bars in response. Elijah laughed quietly. "That's your way of saying amen, huh?" By the seventh morning, word of what Elijah Brooks had done spread beyond the shelter. Volunteers whispered that the blind black man had tamed the untamable K9, the one they used to call a monster. Some came early just to see it happen. though Elijah didn't seem to notice or care. He moved through the hallway as if the building itself breathed with him, his cane tapping softly, his calm, steady voice greeting every sound with warmth. "Morning, Ranger," he said, as he always did, smiling at the faint rustle that meant the dog was already waiting near the door. The metal bars no longer divided them. They marked the boundary of something sacred, a line between what was and what could be. "You ready for our walk today?" Elijah asked, reaching into his pocket for the leash the director had hesitantly given him the night before. Ranger pressed closer, tail sweeping the floor, his posture proud but gentle. "That's my boy," Elijah said. "We're going to take it slow. All right, one step at a time." The director standing near the desk looked anxious. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "I'm not sure he's ready to be out of the cage." Elijah tilted his head toward her voice. "Neither was I," he said softly. "But someone has to believe before it's true." The director said nothing more. She unlocked the cage and stepped back. The sound of the latch opening sent a tremor through the room. For 2 years, no one had dared to open that door. Ranger stood perfectly still, ears forward, eyes focused on Elijah. The man crouched down and extended his hand, holding the leash loosely. "You don't have to wear it," he said. "You just have to know I trust you." Slowly, Ranger stepped out, one paw at a time. The concrete floor felt different, too open, too free, but the rhythm of Elijah's voice anchored him. "That's it," the man murmured. "You're doing fine." He reached forward, his hand brushing the thick fur along Ranger's neck, and for a heartbeat, the world felt impossibly still. Then the leash clicked softly into place. No growl, no tension, just quiet acceptance. Claire, watching from a distance, whispered, "He's out." The director pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't make any noise," she whispered back. "Let them have this." Elijah straightened his grip, light but firm. "Let's go for a walk, partner." Ranger followed, steps slow and deliberate. Together they moved down the corridor, their pace synchronized like they'd been walking side by side for years. When they reached the back door, Elijah stopped. "You ready to meet the world again?" he asked. The dog huffed softly as if answering. Elijah opened the door and the light poured in. Outside, the air was thick with summer heat, and the ground smelled like rain-soaked grass. Elijah took a deep breath. "Smells like freedom, doesn't it?" he said. Ranger's nose lifted to the breeze, catching 1,000 scents at once. Fresh earth, distant cars, the faint tang of the city, and for the first time in years, none of them spelled danger. Elijah stepped forward, and Ranger matched his stride. "That's it," the man said quietly, one heartbeat at a time. They walked slowly around the small field behind the shelter, the world expanding with every step. Elijah could feel the pull of the leash, the rhythm of Ranger's breathing, the subtle shifts of his paws against the earth. It was a symphony of trust. Halfway through their walk, thunder grumbled again, low and distant. Ranger froze, his body rigid. Elijah stopped too, his hand lowering to the dog's back. "Easy," he said softly. "We've been here before, remember? The sky's just talking." The thunder rolled again, louder, closer this time. Ranger trembled, his instincts screaming to flee, but Elijah's hand stayed firm, steady, unafraid. "You're not alone," Elijah whispered. "You'll never be alone again." The leash went slack as the dog's muscles eased under his touch. The thunder faded into silence, and Ranger leaned against Elijah's leg, pressing close until their breaths matched. "That's faith," Elijah murmured, "believing the storm won't take you twice." When they returned inside, the shelter erupted in quiet applause. The volunteers were crying. The director was wiping her eyes, and Claire was smiling through her tears. Elijah just laughed softly. He did all the work, he said, patting Ranger's head. "I just held the leash." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was 2 broken spirits daring to walk again. That evening, as the sun fell low, the director called Elijah into her office. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her voice hesitant, "I need to be honest with you. The board has been discussing closing the shelter for months. Funding cuts. Too many animals we can't place. Elijah frowned slightly, his expression thoughtful. What happens to the ones you can't rehome? The silence that followed was answer enough. He nodded slowly. And Ranger? The director swallowed. If he hadn't met you, we would have had to put him down this week. Elijah's heart clenched, but he didn't raise his voice. Then I guess it's good I showed up when I did. The director looked down, guilt thick in her voice. You saved him, Elijah. He shook his head. No, he said quietly. He saved me first. The next morning, Elijah woke before dawn. He had barely slept, his mind filled with the thought of cages closing and dogs forgotten. He arrived at the shelter early, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. When the director saw him, she frowned. You're here awful early. Elijah smiled faintly. Thought I'd take Ranger for one last walk before the world tries to take it from him. She hesitated, then handed him the keys. Be careful. Outside, the air was cool and damp. The field stretched wide and open, glistening under a thin veil of fog. Elijah unclipped the leash and said, Go on, boy. Ranger hesitated, looking back as if to ask permission. You're free, Elijah said softly. You earned it. The dog took off across the grass, running not with fear, but with joy every stride erasing a year of pain. Elijah listened, smiling through tears, as the sound of paws against wet ground filled the air. It was the sound of resurrection. But then the thunder came again, sharp, sudden, close. The sky cracked open and a flash of lightning struck somewhere beyond the fence. Ranger skidded to a halt, ears flat, eyes wide. Elijah lifted his face toward the sound. Ranger, he called. The dog froze, trembling. Another thunderclap closer. For a split second, the world tilted past and present, colliding. Ranger saw flames again, heard the scream of sirens, smelled the burning. He barked once, panicked, and bolted toward the shelter. Elijah dropped his cane, reaching out blindly. Ranger, it's okay. Listen to me. His voice cut through the wind, strong and steady. Stay with me, boy. You're safe. The dog stopped halfway, panting hard, torn between instinct and trust. Elijah stood still, his voice now softer, but unshaken. It's not the same storm, he said. You're not that dog anymore, and I'm not that man. The thunder cracked again, but this time Ranger didn't run. He turned step by step until he reached Elijah. The man crouched, wrapping his arms around the trembling body. That's my boy, he whispered. You chose to stay. The storm rolled past them, the rain falling in soft, forgiving sheets. Elijah buried his face in the dog's neck and whispered, That's what faith looks like, Ranger. Showing up when you're afraid. By the time they returned inside, both were soaked, but neither cared. The volunteers cheered when they saw them dripping and smiling like survivors of something holy. The director approached with a towel, shaking her head in disbelief. He came back to you, she said. Elijah nodded, his voice rough with emotion. He always would. The morning after, the storm sunlight spilled across the city like a quiet apology. The streets still glistened from the rain, and the air smelled of renewal. At the shelter, the world felt lighter. The staff moved differently, as though something sacred had passed through the halls overnight. Claire unlocked the doors and found Elijah Brooks already there, his coat damp at the edges, a thermos of coffee in one hand, and a small duffel bag in the other. You didn't sleep again, did you? She asked gently. Elijah smiled. Sleep can wait, new beginnings can't. She followed his gaze toward Ranger's cage, now wide open. The dog lay near the entrance, head resting on his paws, calm and waiting. You ready, partner? Elijah asked. Ranger stood instantly, tail lifting, eyes bright. The director stepped forward, holding a stack of papers trembling in her hands. Mr. Brooks? She said carefully, the board approved your adoption request this morning. For a moment, Elijah said nothing. His lips parted in disbelief, then curved into the smallest, most honest smile she had ever seen. He's mine, he asked softly. He's yours, she confirmed, tears in her eyes. Ranger barked once, as if answering for them both. The paperwork was a blur. Elijah signed each page with fingers that shook not from uncertainty, but from gratitude. When it was done, the director handed him the final document, a certificate that read, "Adopted Ranger Service Dog Retired." Elijah folded it carefully, tucking it inside his coat pocket like a sacred promise. "You hear that, boy?" he said, turning toward the sound of Ranger's breathing. "You're coming home." The dog pressed his head against Elijah's leg, a gesture of loyalty so deep it silenced the room. Claire sniffled quietly. "He was never supposed to leave this place," she whispered. The director smiled through her tears. Maybe it was never about leaving. Maybe it was about finding where he belongs. Elijah clipped the leash gently, but Ranger didn't need it. They walked side by side out of the shelter, each step measured, deliberate, perfect in its rhythm. The sunlight hit them just as the door closed behind, casting their shadows long across the wet pavement. People on the street paused to watch a blind black man walking with a dog, once labeled dangerous. They didn't know the story, but they felt its weight in the quiet dignity of their stride. At the corner, Elijah stopped. He reached down and unclipped the leash, his voice soft but certain. "Go ahead, Ranger. Choose your path." The dog looked up at him, then at the open street, and without hesitation sat down beside him. Elijah laughed. "Yeah," he said, "that's what I thought. You already chose." Their home was a modest apartment on the edge of the city, 2 blocks from the river, and close enough to hear the trains at night. Elijah opened the door, letting Ranger explore the new space. The dog sniffed everything: the couch, the rug, the small table by the window, then returned to Elijah's side. "You don't need to ask permission anymore," Elijah said, smiling. "This is yours too." He set down a bowl of water and a blanket near the door, then lowered himself into the armchair that faced the window. Ranger circled twice before lying down beside him, pressing his body close. The apartment filled with silence, but it wasn't the empty kind. It was the peace that follows survival. Elijah reached down, fingers brushing Ranger's fur. "You know," he said quietly, "people think rescuing a dog means saving it. But the truth is, they save us first." That night, as the city settled, Elijah brewed tea and turned on the old radio. A gospel choir sang softly through the static. Ranger lifted his head, listening, his eyes closing at the sound of Elijah humming along. The rhythm of his master's voice was the same one that had pulled him from nightmares and thunder. He rested his head on Elijah's foot, content. "That's right," Elijah whispered. "No cages, no orders, just you and me." The dog sighed, the deep, heavy kind of sigh that meant safety. Elijah leaned back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: home. Days passed, and the world adjusted to the sight of them together. Every morning, neighbors watched as Elijah and Ranger walked along the river trail. Some nodded, some smiled, some even stopped to ask about the dog. "Police K9, Elijah would say proudly, "retired but still on duty." When they'd ask what that duty was, he'd smile and answer, keeping an old man's heart beating. Children would run up to pet Ranger, their laughter echoing through the park. The dog stood still, patient and calm, no longer haunted by ghosts. At night, Elijah would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, Ranger lying beside him. The city lights shimmered on the water, and he'd talk about everything and nothing. "You know, I used to think blindness meant darkness," he said one evening. "But I see more now than I ever did before. I see kindness in small things. I see grace in second chances." He reached down, scratching Ranger's ear. "You're my proof of that, old boy. But peace, like light, is fragile." One afternoon, while walking home from the store, Elijah heard sirens in the distance, the wail of emergency vehicles cutting through traffic. The sound froze him in place, the memory of fire roaring in his ears. Ranger stopped too, his body stiff against the tension in Elijah's grip. "It's okay," Elijah said, voice unsteady. "We're not there. We're here." The dog's weight steadied him, grounding him back to the present. They waited together until the sirens faded, and Elijah exhaled. "Guess we're both still learning how to breathe through it," he murmured. Ranger nudged his hand, and the moment passed. That night, the director called to check in. "How's he doing?" she asked. Elijah smiled into the receiver. "He's learning what peace sounds like," she chuckled softly. "And you?" He paused, then said, "I'm learning too." Before hanging up, she said, "You know the shelter's quieter without you two. But every time it rains, I think of that day, you and Ranger in the storm." Elijah nodded even though she couldn't see him. "That wasn't a storm," he said gently. "That was the start of something holy." Later, Elijah sat by the window, the moonlight spilling across the room. He ran his hand along the top of Ranger's head, feeling the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing. "You did it," he whispered. "You came back from the fire." Ranger stirred, pressing closer, and Elijah smiled. "So did I." He leaned back, closing his eyes as the night deepened around them. Outside, a train passed its horn, echoing faintly, but inside the small apartment, there was only warmth and the sound of two lives finally at rest. In the weeks that followed, something miraculous happened. Ranger began to guide Elijah instinctively. Without formal training, he learned to stop at curbs, to nudge the man away from obstacles, to lead him through crowds. The director visited once and gasped. "He's acting like a guide dog." Elijah laughed. "He's acting like family." The woman smiled, tears in her eyes. "You two were meant to find each other." He nodded. "Yeah, two souls, one heartbeat." The evening the storm returned began quietly, almost tenderly, as if the world were holding its breath before testing the faith that Elijah Brooks and Ranger had built. The air was thick and heavy, the sky bruised with low-gray clouds that crawled across the horizon. Inside their small apartment near the river, Elijah sat by the window with his fingers tracing the braille pages of a worn Bible, his lips moving silently to the rhythm of familiar verses. Ranger lay at his feet, dozing lightly, his body warm against the man's legs. The radio hummed in the background, a gospel song whispering through the static. When the first rumble of thunder rolled in from the distance, both man and dog looked up at the same time, one with his ears, the other with his heart. "Sounds like an old friend coming back," Elijah said softly, setting the book aside. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, uncertain, but not afraid. "It's just weather," Elijah murmured. "We've seen worse, haven't we, boy?" The dog gave a low, reassuring grunt, and Elijah smiled. "Yeah, that's what I thought." But by nightfall, the storm had gathered its strength. The wind howled through the cracks of the old windows, and the rain beat against the glass in relentless rhythm. Lightning flared, followed by a thunderclap, so loud that the building seemed to shake. Ranger stood body-rigid, memories of chaos flickering behind his eyes. Elijah heard the shift in the dog's breathing before the growl even began. He set his cane aside and knelt, his voice low and firm. Hey, you're not there. You're here. You're home. Listen to me." Ranger's ears flicked, torn between fear and familiarity. Elijah kept speaking each word, slow, deliberate, like a rope thrown across a chasm. "That sound used to mean danger, I know, but now it means you have someone to protect, and someone who will protect you." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the small room. Elijah felt the tremor in the floor and reached forward until his hands found Ranger's neck. The dog froze, then leaned into the touch, his muscles quivering under Elijah's steady palms. "That's it," Elijah whispered. "You don't have to fight the thunder anymore. Just breathe with me." The next crack of thunder shook the power out of the building. The lights flickered, then died. The apartment fell into darkness, and the only sound was the rain hammering against the roof. Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his tone. "It's all right, boy. Darkness doesn't scare me." Ranger pressed closer, his heartbeat thudding against Elijah's chest. "See," Elijah said softly, "we got this." But as the storm deepened, the wind outside tore down a power line. The faint smell of smoke and ozone filled the air, sharp and immediate. Ranger's instincts flared. He barked once sharp and loud, then again louder, pacing near the window. "What is it?" Elijah asked, standing carefully. "You smell something." The dog barked again, moving toward the door. Elijah grabbed his coat, trusting the urgency in that sound. "All right," he said. "Show me." When he opened the door, the hallway was filled with faint smoke curling upward like ghosts from a memory they both knew too well. The building's old wiring had sparked somewhere below. "Okay," Elijah said, grabbing his cane and bending low. "We've done this before, haven't we? We go slow, we go smart." Ranger barked once more, circling him before pressing against his leg, guiding him toward the stairs. "Good boy," Elijah murmured, "nice and easy." The stairwell was dim-lit only by the occasional flash of lightning from the windows. Each rumble of thunder made the structure groan, but Ranger's body was steady beside him, a living compass. "Left here," Elijah asked, and the dog nudged his thigh in answer. They moved floor by floor through heat and smoke, until the exit door loomed ahead. Outside, the rain fell harder, drenching them instantly. Elijah coughed, lungs burning. "We made it," he said between breaths. "You got us out." They stood in the storm, soaked and shaking, the rain washing soot from Elijah's skin. Fire trucks wailed in the distance, growing closer. Neighbors poured out of the building, shouting, clutching children and pets. Through the chaos, Elijah crouched beside Ranger, holding the dog's face in both hands. "You did it, Ranger," he said, voice breaking. "You faced the fire and didn't run. You saved me." The dog leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Elijah's. "You saved us both," Elijah whispered. The firefighters arrived and began their work, rushing past the two figures crouched in the rain. One of them stopped, glancing down at the sight. "Sir, are you all right?" Elijah smiled faintly. "We're fine, son. My dog just remembered how to be brave." The young firefighter recognized him then. "You're Brooks," he said in surprise. "The one who—" Elijah nodded gently. "Yeah, once upon a time." The man's gaze softened. "You still saving people, huh?" Elijah chuckled. "Not people this time, just souls." When the flames were out, the chief approached. "We can put you up somewhere for the night," he offered. Elijah shook his head. "We've got a friend who will take us in." He turned toward Ranger, who was shaking the water from his coat. "Right, partner." The dog barked once, tail wagging despite exhaustion. Together they walked through the rain toward the shelter, the one place that had witnessed their first miracle. The director met them at the door, eyes wide with concern. "Oh my God," she gasped. "Are you both all right?" Elijah smiled through the downpour. "Better than all right," he said. "We just survived another storm." She ushered them in, wrapping towels around them both, though Ranger kept wriggling to stay near Elijah. "You two look like ghosts," she said softly. Maybe Elijah answered, "But we're the kind that come back." Later, after the building quieted and the thunder faded into distance, Elijah sat on the floor of the shelter, leaning against the same wall where he had first met Ranger months ago. The dog rested beside him, head on his lap. "Funny how life works," Elijah said, his voice tired but light. "The same kind of fire that took everything from us just tried again. But this time, we walked out together." He stroked the dog's fur slowly. "That's what redemption looks like, isn't it? Doing the same thing that once broke you and winning." Ranger made a soft noise, half sigh, half purr, and Elijah chuckled. "Don't worry, I'm not turning this into a sermon. I just needed to say thank you." The director watched from the doorway for a moment before speaking. "You know," she said quietly, "I think he was always waiting for someone like you, someone who understood." Elijah shook his head gently. "No," he said, "we were waiting for each other." The woman smiled, stepping back to give them peace. The shelter lights dimmed, leaving only the hum of the generator and the rhythm of their breathing. The morning after the fire, the world seemed painfully quiet, like the city itself was still trying to catch its breath. The shelter smelled faintly of wet fur and smoke, and sunlight spilled through the windows in gentle streaks, touching every cage with warmth. Elijah Brooks sat at the small wooden table near the entrance, a cup of coffee in his hands, his cane leaning against the wall beside him. Ranger lay curled at his feet, one paw resting over Elijah's boot, sleeping peacefully after the long night. The director and Claire moved quietly around them, speaking in whispers, as though afraid to disturb the sacred stillness. "You should rest," Claire said softly. Elijah smiled, his voice low and worn but calm. "Rest is a blessing for those who finish their work. We're still walking hours." He reached down his fingers, brushing Ranger's head. "Ain't that right, boy?" The dog's tail thumped once in answer. Elijah took a slow sip of his coffee. His blind eyes turned toward the sound of rain outside. "Funny thing about storms," he said, "they come to test what you've built. But if you're lucky, they show you what was real all along." The director stepped closer, holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said, "from the fire department. I think they finally found the file you asked about months ago." Elijah took it carefully, feeling the raised seal beneath his fingertips. "The one from the old fire?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, the night you lost your sight." Elijah set down his coffee and tore the envelope open. Inside was a single page, a letter written years ago by his former partner, the man who had died in the blaze. The ink was faded, but the words were sharp and alive. He read slowly, tracing the Braille translation the department had included. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out the letter began. You were always the brave one, Elijah. You ran toward things the rest of us ran from. Don't ever let that light die, even if the world goes dark." Elijah's throat tightened. He folded the paper carefully and placed it over his heart. "He must have written it before the call," he whispered. He knew. The director's eyes glistened. "What are you going to do with it?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Keep it where it belongs, right next to my heartbeat." Later that afternoon, Elijah and Ranger returned home. The apartment had survived, though the windows were blackened around the edges. The smell of smoke lingered in the walls, but the place still felt alive. Ranger walked through each room as if checking that every shadow had been pushed out. Elijah followed his footsteps, hand-brushing the walls, feeling the warmth that had replaced the cold. "We did it, partner," he said. "We walked through fire and didn't lose ourselves." Ranger pressed his head against Elijah's knee, his body trembling slightly from exhaustion. "You rest now," Elijah whispered. "You've earned it." He sat down in his old armchair, the same one by the window where he used to read aloud. The radio on the shelf crackled to life, unexpectedly, the same gospel choir singing softly through the static. "We'll walk together in the light," the voices said, and Elijah chuckled. "Guess the universe knows our song." Days turned into weeks. The city moved on, but Elijah and Ranger became something of a quiet legend. People who passed them on the street whispered, "That's him, the blind man, and the dog that saved each other." Elijah didn't care for the attention. He just smiled, tipping his head politely as Ranger guided him through crosswalks, his pace strong but measured. Children still ran up to pet the dog, and Ranger stood patiently, letting small hands tug at his ears. The world had given them back their peace, and they wore it like armor. But one crisp autumn morning, Elijah woke with a heaviness in his chest. He sat in his chair, feeling for Ranger's warmth, and found it still beside him. The dog was breathing slow and steady, but weaker than usual. "Hey there," Elijah said gently. "You tired today?" Ranger blinked, once his tail moving faintly. Elijah smiled through the ache rising in his throat. "It's all right, old friend. We've done more living than most ever dream of." He stayed beside him all day, humming their song, speaking softly, until the rhythm of their breaths became one. That night, when the first stars appeared, Ranger lifted his head one last time, pressing his nose into Elijah's palm. The man felt it, the weight, the warmth, the farewell. "You've been my eyes," he whispered, "and I've been your faith. That's a fair trade." Ranger exhaled softly, his body relaxing against Elijah's leg, and the room fell still. Elijah sat there for a long time, his fingers resting in the dog's fur, feeling the echo of a heartbeat that had guided him through every storm. He didn't cry right away. The silence was too holy for that. When he finally spoke, his voice was a prayer. You see for me and I'll believe for you. That was the deal, wasn't it? He smiled through tears that fell soundlessly onto the dog's coat. You kept your promise. In the weeks that followed, Elijah wrote again. He wrote in Braille page after page about second chances, about faith, about the kind of love that teaches broken souls how to live again. The final entry he titled, "The Letter He Left Behind." In it he wrote, "He saw for me when I could not. He trusted me when no one else would. And when the world went dark again, he reminded me that light doesn't live in the eyes, it lives in the heart." When he finished, he folded the pages neatly and sent them to the shelter, asking that they be kept with Ranger's file, so that when someone new comes through your door, he wrote, and you're tempted to give up on them, you'll remember what love can do. The shelter framed the letter and hung it above the main desk. Volunteers began to call it Ranger's Wall. Visitors would pause to read the story, their eyes glistening as they reached the last line. Sometimes the ones we rescue are the ones sent to rescue us. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, the staff would gather in the hallway, light a candle beneath the plaque, and tell the story again, the story of a blind black man and a broken canine who found each other in a world that had given up on them both. Children grew up hearing it. Officers came to see it before adopting new dogs. The story became a quiet reminder that no soul, no matter how lost, is beyond redemption. Years passed. Elijah's hair turned silver, his steps slower, but his spirit remained unshaken. He still walked the same path along the river, his cane tapping softly, his other hand brushing the empty space beside him where Ranger once walked. "You still there, boy?" he would ask the wind, and sometimes it felt like he heard the faint thump of a tail in reply. He'd smile, lift his face toward the sunlight, and whisper, "I know you are." And when strangers asked about the old man walking alone, the shelter director, now gray-haired herself, would tell them, "He's never alone. He's walking with faith." The end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about faith, love, and second chances. Tell me what you think about Elijah and Ranger's journey. Did the ending move you? I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your city or country in the comments below.